It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event, the book launch of this important book. We will have a book voucher for a 30 or 40% discount that Dr. Hughes will share in just a second. And we are here to welcome, to have the bris, to baptism of this baby, depending on where you are coming from, Holocaust Memory and Youth Performance. Couple of housekeeping costs and then introduction of our esteemed speakers. So I'm not doing this alone. I'm doing this in cooperation with my colleagues from Theatre and Performance Studies here at the University of Warwick. You may have already noticed that I started recording. So by being here and with us, you are consenting to being recorded. And after this talk, we will upload it on YouTube. Nowadays, these talks are very useful for people who are preparing for comprehensive exams and so on. So in terms of structure, we will first have about 40 minutes of discussion between Dr. Erika Hughes and Dr. Rebecca Rovit, and then we will open for discussion for under 20 or 30 minutes, depending how it goes. We don't want to keep you up too long. Now I have the great pleasure of introducing our brilliant speakers. First, the author of the book we are welcoming today, Dr. Erika Hughes, is reader in performance at the University of Portsmouth, and she's also the interim head of film, media, and communication. She is not only a scholar of theatre, she's also an applied director, and she's directed in various plays. She, for example, has been leading the Veteran Project, which is a performance and all history with soldier veterans. And also together with me, she co-wrote a documentary play about the first lesbian Holocaust survivor who bore testimony, The Amazing Life of Margot Heumann. I co-wrote it with her, but Erika directed it, and she directed it very beautifully. And in fact, the woman who plays me is here with us, Dr. Phoebe Ramsey. She has held a number of important fellowships. We were together fellows at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She was a Berlin fellow at the Free University in Berlin, and she was also George Mossey Fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And she speaks a scary number of difficult languages and an amazing mensch and scholar. Professor Rebecca Rovit is working on theatre at the University of Kansas, and she is the scholar of theatre in the Holocaust. This is why I was very keen to have her here, and I was so delighted when she said yes immediately. Allow me to introduce two books that she has published. Very important for my own work on theatre in Theresienstadt was her co-edited collection, Theatrical Performance During the Holocaust, together with Alvin Goldfarb, which she co-edited. And she also wrote about the, as I like to call it, the Kubo. She wrote a book, The Jewish Kulturbund Theater Company in Nazi Berlin. She's working currently on a new book about theater in the ruins, or theater from the rubble of war, about post-war Vienna and Berlin theater. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. And now I pass on to you.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for such a gracious introduction. And Erika, congratulations on your book launch and the book. It is really a pleasure over the decade plus since I started using your work in my classes with my students to see your full-length book. Thank you all for coming across different time zones and from different places. Best greetings from Vienna, where I am right now. Kind of exciting to have us together in the room. Erika, your work tracks almost 20 years in research about the Holocaust and youth drama, the changing cultural discourse regarding genocide, remembrance, and performance in 3 countries, and pedagogically, what our young audiences need to know or can tolerate safely. That's 20 years, that's more than a generation. If we consider 15 to 20 years, more or less a generation, and that's really important when we talk about young people. I think many of our listeners here are from the arts, but perhaps there are a few who are not. And your title is laden with three really exciting, words or compound words that have literatures of their own. The Holocaust Memory and Youth Performance. So would you just start by giving us a little bit of a précis of what this book is about to get us started?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Rebecca, for agreeing to host this and to read my work. And as you know, I'm a fan, and so it's really an honor to get to talk to you about it with this awesome community of folks as well, many of whom I know. And huge thanks to Anna Hájková and for the very kind introduction and for inviting me, and massive thanks to University of Warwick. So I'm just very grateful. So the book, so Holocaust Memory and Youth Performance, is yeah, as you rightly say, it's a transdisciplinary study that intersects with Holocaust studies, which in itself is a really inter and transdisciplinary field that is, just as much concerned with the history of the event as with our understandings of how it's represented in the present and how those representations have changed over the last 75 years. It's also engaging in memory studies, and so really thinking about what is it to remember. And so because this is a work that's looking at theater, what kind of embodied memory means in a Holocaust context, but then also in a civic context. Because as you noted, the book is looking at Holocaust performances for young audiences from 3 countries, Germany, Israel, and the United States. And the reason for choosing these 3 countries has to do with their interrelated relationships, both with the historical event of the Holocaust, but then also their continuing and ongoing relationships post-Holocaust with those 3 countries, and how they're always in dialogue. The memory of the Holocaust is always in dialogue with not just their own individual understandings of the event, so as a nation state, but also in relation to one another. And then the third thing that this book does, which is, in many respects probably the most unusual and the most unique, is that it applies Holocaust studies and memory studies to youth performance. And this is something that's actually quite different. So in the kind of large world of theater studies, children's theater, youth performance is often an overlooked or a neglected field. Now, this has really changed in no small part because of the work of scholars like Manon van de Water, who's here and who I studied with, and similarly, the sort of recognition, I think, globally of the sort of power and the usefulness of youth theater and performance, but also the impact that youth theater and performance can have in education. So it's probably no surprise when you really unpick it that there are lots and lots and lots of plays for and by young people about the Holocaust. Although it might sound jarring, when I tell people the topic of the book, sometimes people are a bit, oh gosh, imagining what that is. But then actually most people have seen a Holocaust play for young audiences, and most people have actually seen The Diary of Anne Frank. But so yes, as you rightly say, it is a very intersectional, very interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary project.
Can you just sort of in a nutshell tell us how you see what you would define, how you would define a Holocaust theater performance, and then perhaps what would distinguish the specific category for young people from adult Holocaust theater? But first, Holocaust performance, then the distinguishing characteristics.
Yeah, so Holocaust performance is it's a huge genre. And one of the things I do in the book, both overtly by saying it and covertly by including different kinds of examples, is that I really think that Holocaust performance is, it's almost like, maybe it transcends the notion of a kind of a genre. It's really, there are over 1,000 plays written about the Holocaust that are recorded in the Holocaust Theater online catalog that is housed at University of Miami. So it's a massive, it's not even a canon really. But Holocaust plays are really any kind of performance. Holocaust plays or performances are really any kind of performative engagement with the Holocaust, and it can be specifically about. Sometimes they're factual. Sometimes, to borrow from Lawrence Langer, they're factually fictive, and then sometimes, particularly with youth plays, they're about not the Holocaust itself, but about how the Holocaust impacts our understanding of the present moment and how Holocaust memory, the importance of Holocaust memory and the importance of commemoration. They include normal kind of what's referred to as straight plays, musicals. I have an Instagram performance. There's an Israeli rock concert. There's a work of what I would call kind of applied theater by Amichai Pardo, who's also here. He's one of the performers whose work and playwrights whose work is featured in the book. Some of the work is by big theater companies that big kind of national youth theater companies or really established companies like the Orna Porat in Israel, or the Berliner Ensemble in Germany. Sometimes they're small performances that happen in community centers or schools. Sometimes it's devised work. So it's a huge kind of umbrella. Similarly, youth performance is a huge umbrella term, but probably the most important thing I can say about it is that youth itself is a really culturally specific notion. So, I've lived in all the countries that are discussed in the book, and now I live in the United Kingdom. I'm from the United States originally. Each of these countries defines youth and understands youth differently. Youth is sometimes a legal definition, right? You can do certain things at certain points after you've hit a kind of a benchmark, whether that's drinking or purchasing alcohol or driving a car or voting, but your designation as youth is oftentimes positioned as other than adulthood, which is how you sort of participate as a civic member of society, right? Particularly around voting. But each of these different societies also has different understandings of the way that youth then functions in an educational framework as well. And so sometimes, and just sort of culturally as well. So sometimes a youth performance might be for individuals from, say, 16 to 25. Sometimes it might be for individuals aged 7 to 12. It really just depends on the kind of the place, the site that's doing the defining. But one of the things that I try and examine in this short book, and I try and do a lot of things, in this not very long book, is use Holocaust plays as a way for us to also see the differences in which these cultures understand and define youth. The conversation, how to remember the Holocaust and how to understand who young people are, they're in dialogue with one another.
And I definitely want to ask you more specifically about the different countries, because for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the table of contents, the book is structured according to, well, the first chapter is for future generations, and I want to start there. But then you go on to Germany, Israel, and the US. And so the very specific, even if there are commonalities, the specific, as you call them, dramaturgies that are linked to the societies need some explication. But first, because of age and because certainly in the US we're into, are we up to the Gen Alpha now? So X, Y, Z, Gen Alpha, these are the audiences, in a sense, that your plays are targeting. Is that right?
Yes, yes. So because of the sort of, sorry, Apple Music just started on my laptop and I'm not really sure why.
That's got to be Gen Z, right?
I think it's the specter of the generational youth lording over. No, so the plays in this book were for baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, Gen Z, Alpha, and that's because, youth itself is, we've talked about it being a malleable category and a category that depends on which, which sort of country you're in or which cultural space that you're in. But there's always a category of youth. It's just that youth individual experiences, the notion of a generation means what are the common experiences that people born between this date and this date share. And a lot of that has to do with technology. So, for example, I don't know how many folks in this audience might have had the experience of having a young person in their life who actually maybe knows quite a bit more than they do about operating certain sort of, technical things. Young people are, there's a certain kind of a technical literacy. This is one way of kind of looking at it. Young people are, they have a generational kind of encapsulated experience that is theirs, and that really kind of should be respected as theirs and as unified. So one of the things that I've had to do in researching this book is thinking really broadly around what are the kinds of performance practices and what are the kinds of, how has performance changed over the years, over these last, particularly kind of 50 years that I've looked at, and 20 years of like actually examining these plays, because I started looking at this project, almost 20 years ago. And so, the performance has changed. Like, there are oftentimes plays are shorter. There's different kinds of stimuli. There's different kinds of tech that's involved. But these are kind of like generalizations that I'm making, because some of these plays have really stood the test of time. And as I say in the book, some of them have been running for, 20, 30 years. And so then it's about the relationship between, so the play text and then the different kinds of productions that happen. Or for that matter, so, like I said, Amikai Pardo is here, and he's doing performance that actually involves young people directly. So he'll be in the audience with young people, getting them to actually co-perform with him. And so the ways in which those conversations might have changed over the last 15, 20 years since he's been working on the project, or not. Because some things actually are surprisingly consistent, despite the fact that you're working with multiple generations. So this project, so again, there's many kind of moving parts when I even define who the youth are for this context.
And so Amikai Pardo is based in Israel. I think that's in the Israeli chapter, as is this rather extraordinary Instagram Ava.stories that will be something that is interactive, that is highly geared towards our youngest. So I want to just take you back a little bit, because in a sense, all these kids and teenagers and now people who have passed into adulthood and began to see some of the plays that you write about, these people have very little experience firsthand with the Holocaust. And one of the things that's quite fascinating in your study is how you bring up a kind of focus on intergenerational memory. And I'd like, if you would, to talk a little bit, and since there are so many plays in so many countries, maybe you could just kind of choose one example to talk about how these performances actually tie in to intergenerational aspects of memory, that these kids clearly, it's not even hearsay anymore for the Snapchat kids. Can you talk a little bit about how you go about analyzing that?
Yeah. So if I'll take a kind of an example from each country, and then really focusing on sort of intergenerationality within that. The first one I would say, so I structure the book, and I know we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later, but I start with Germany. as the first chapter. And the first play that I look at is called From Today On, Your Name is Sarah, Apoy tu heißt du Sarah. And that's actually the image from the cover of the book is from this play. It's from the Gripstheater in Berlin. And it's been running continuously since 1989. And the play is actually running this week at Grips, so it's in their rep. And it was written based on a book by Inga Deutschkorn called Ich trug den gelben Stern, and I wore the yellow star, and it was her autobiography of her youth in Berlin. And she was actually in hiding during the entire period. She and her mother went underground. They were helped very much by Otto Veit, who is remembered as righteous among the nations. You can actually go to his museum, get a factory for workers who are blind in Berlin. And you can go visit his factory and you can see some of the documents that he forged. You can see actually the secret room that he hid people in. But what's really important about that one as an intergenerational play is the way in which Inga's own presence was really pivotal to the writing of the play, but then also the kind of afterlife of the play. She only died really recently, just maybe 18 months ago. And so she lived a really long, full life. And after the war, she was a displaced person for a while. And then she finally ended up in Israel, where she was a reporter for Ma'ariv, and then moved back to Berlin finally. And the play itself was actually really instrumental in sort of bringing her back to Berlin, because she herself became so a play, and you see this a lot in Holocaust theater of a certain era, where we're getting so that we're too far away from the event itself for this to really be the case now. But certainly in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, having survivor presence at a play was really, really pivotal. And so the Gripstheater involved her in every part of the writing process. I mean, they had her autobiography, but they also had, the playwrights, Volker Ludwig and Detlef Michel, had really frequent meetings with her to check with things, because, they took an entire multi-year experience, and collapsed it into 3 hours. And so, of course, she knew that there would be composite characters, there would be things, done for, dramatic economy. And so, in a sense, that was also a generational thing, because the playwrights themselves were part of the 68er generation. And so they were this first generation in Berlin to start really questioning their parents' generation and saying, why did you do this? Why didn't you stand up? Really critiquing. And so that political critique was then really explicitly folded into the play. And then Inga became really a part of the play itself, because very frequently there would be runs where she then would come and do a Q&A after. And this for years, almost 2 decades. I got to see one of the performances where she came and did a Q&A. And it was really, really powerful, because you see the actor on the stage, and then you see the survivor on the stage. And of course, it's not about verisimilitude. It's about this process of being told, yes, you can and you should actually carry on the telling of this story. So for the second one, in Israel, so how I've examined that is really from a historical lens, right? Is really, really looking at the ways in which the multi-generational component of how this has been transmitted down these different generations. So in Israel, I guess the next example that I would give, I've talked about, and I'll talk more about 10 Matchboxes, which is the show by Amichai Pardo, a little bit later in a different context. But I also wanted to mention Musica, or The Sound of Memory, which is actually a performance series that's done at Yad Vashem. And that performance actually brings together, so Yad Vashem, for those of you who don't know, is the largest Holocaust museum and memorial, and also huge archive in Jerusalem and Israel, and it's state supported. and it's a very, very large complex with lots of different kinds of programming. And they've traditionally not done typical theater there because, again, they want, there's a real fear of verisimilitude, and there's a real fear of making young people feel, sentimentally like they understand something, when actually, like, the analogy, what's more important is to maybe teach that you can't understand, or that there are things that are really beyond your grasp, but they're really important to understand and know about. And so Musica, or Sound of Memory, they've changed the name of it, brings together survivors and music students. And they've done also work with dance and with drama students as well, but it's primarily music students. And they have letters, and then they have poems that were written by either people who survived the Holocaust or people who died during the Holocaust. Some of them are really famous Israelis, whose work is Uri Orlev and Dan Pagis. And then the young people create songs, and then they have a concert. And sometimes they're full-on rock songs, or kind of, so they're songs that you might not assume would be, when we think about kind of genre of sort of Holocaust, music that we might associate with Holocaust memory. It might be more somber, it might, have strings, it might have a kind of a sad undertone. But what this project does is it really invites these young musicians to really create their own relationship to the Holocaust by creating a kind of a new memory for themselves. But this is all guided by these workshops that Yad Vashem has with Holocaust survivors. So it's not done in isolation where they're just taking a song or they're just taking a poem and making some music to it. There's always a dialogue with individuals who were there. And then in the United States, I guess the last example that I would briefly mention is a really interesting play called Anne and Emmett. And that is by Janet Langard Cohen, and whose husband is William Cohen, who was the Secretary of Defense during the Clinton administration. And this play imagines a conversation between Anne Frank and Emmett Till, who is a young man, Black American, who was murdered at the age of 14. He was lynched, and only some maybe 6-7 years after Anne Frank was murdered. So the imagined conversation is one element of this play, but the other element of this play is, again, Janet Langard Cohen and William Cohen also conducted a series of dialogues that went in collaboration with the play. And so they did the series. You can actually kind of read the transcripts of some of these early conversations. The play actually rose out of having, because Janet Langard Cohen is a Black American, William Cohen, he is of Jewish descent on his father's side. And so both of them have a really complicated relationship. So they both go to a synagogue, but they both have a very kind of American reform relationship to Judaism. And what they were really trying to investigate was their own relationship to the United States and to what it means to be a bystander in a very present day scenario. So in all the examples that I've kind of pulled, it's inherent to the dramaturgy to have a voice that is older in the creation of a Holocaust play that's designed to think about what the next generation's experiences will be. Sorry, that was a long answer, but it's 3 countries.
No, I think it's fascinating because the examples that you gave not only show the memory passed on, but memory scholars usually say that memory is retrospective. We can't, we look at what is going on now, like in the streets of Berlin these days. Young people are going around, demonstrating against the right-wing parties on the rise and the populists, and they're saying never again is now. And then they're merging in Berlin with the Fridays for the Future, and they're conflating narratives that you know, bring up war and, you know, tyranny and destruction and in the moment. So your example of Anne and Emmett, and I definitely want to get to Anne, you know, and Frank before we end, is really pertinent, I think, as is, I think you divide the responses to the Holocaust sort of generally with the guilt ridden next generations and their kin, next of kin in Germany, to perpetrators, to Israel, where Israel, you know, arose from the ashes of the Holocaust, and a kind of a responsibility, and then bystander, or be an active witness. I mean, it's about post-witnessing.
Yeah.
But again, something else that you bring up that I thought was, you know, really quite unique, is you, in that first chapter, again, which I think sets the stage, if you will, for the rest of the chapters in terms of obviously focusing on the next generations. You center a concept by Hannah Arendt called natality. And I wonder if you could explain what that means in the context of youth performance, and even vis-a-vis the adult Holocaust plays, which you mentioned a little bit earlier, however you wish, but it's not a term that many of us in theater use, and you use it quite uniquely, I think.
So, so yeah, natality is this idea that Hannah Arendt it talks about in her book, The Human Condition. And the idea is that natality means that we're not stuck in patterns of ways of doing things. And so that what that means is that there's a kind of a fresh start that is possible. And she uses the term natality to think about a new birth, or just in terms of new political potentials for individuals, and how, you know, action is always, you know, a new action is always possible in human history. So it's not this kind of like teleological, we're headed only to this direction kind of idea. And Adele Sr. used this idea to think about children's bodies and what children's bodies might mean, and looking at some work by Milo Rao. And I really appreciated her work on that. And then it made me start thinking about Holocaust plays really differently, because, you know, it's not the same as to say that a Holocaust play is a kind of a sentimental thing that says, okay, bullying is, you know, we have this kind of idea of sort of bad Holocaust theater maybe being kind of like, okay, bullying is very bad. Yeah, that's not, you know, and so you have this kind of sentimentality in a fair number of Holocaust plays, none of which I talk about in the book. I only talk about plays that I think are really, really fantastic and really important in different ways. But instead, natality is a political act, or it's a political category of behavior. And so it helped me to kind of think about ways in which these Holocaust plays for young audiences, and with young audiences and with young performers, are really acts of resistance against the notion of you know, history repeating itself, or you know, and for a kind of a potential way of thinking about this kind of space of memory making as a really politically active one. And what it also does, I think, is help us see that the you know, the young people that are depicted in these plays, it's not just about kind of victimhood. It's really memory is also, it can also be an act of resistance, in terms of when you just think about how narratives are constructed, when you think about the way in which, you know, a historical narrative you know, defines you know, civic engagement, defines a society oftentimes. I think these young youth plays really serve as interventions into youth agency, and thinking really specifically about about youth as civic individuals in the present, not just later, not just when they turn 18. And I think, I think this is really salient when you mentioned the, the climate strike Fridays movement, and we could really kind of see that power reverberating when young people are really taking control of and rejecting the frameworks that they're typically kind of forced into. And then I would just briefly say, so I did want to mention 10 Matchboxes, the Amichai Pardo play. This is, I think, that's a really good example because when the Janusz Korczak character, Janusz Korczak, for those of you who don't know, was this really famous Polish educator. It's actually his pen name. His real name was Henryk Goldschmidt. But so he was murdered during the Holocaust. He had a really incredible series of orphanages, and he was a pedagogue and worked really closely with young people. And what 10 Matchboxes, this play, does is it rewrites the play is different every single time you do it. So it's that play in and of itself is really rejecting our notion of one fixed understanding of the event, being sort of input into young people. But again, it's an example kind of similar to the Musica Sound of Memory play. It invites young people to create their own relationship to the historical past, and in so doing, thinking then about how they're going to take that into their own lives and what they're going to be doing themselves as currently present political agents. Hope that made sense.
And so that malleable performing theatrical youth on stage creates also the possibility of a kind of identification with the young people, the natality, the potential. I think at one point in the first chapter, you juxtapose it, just in terms of the words, with natality versus, mortality.
Yeah.
And really some of the more adult plays, though I should caution and in fact iterate to this audience that this book does give serious adult attention to plays that are not just for children, and really have messages beyond that, which leads me to kind of get you to talk perhaps more, and perhaps you even want to, I don't know, you can start with Israel, since you mentioned that one, but you distinguish three rather distinct, what you call Holocaust dramaturgies, with a link to cultural identity. You already touched on that, but I wonder if you want to iterate what those are, how you mean them, because they're clearly about theatrical performance, and perhaps techniques. And then if you would, since your study is longitudinal, whether or not you meant it, you've got another book there, because I want to know, and maybe some others want to know, how the dramaturgies have changed over the last 10 to 15 years, given that some of your examples, with the exception of some of the Anne Frank plays and Ab heute heißt du Sarah, are different. So first of all, distinct Holocaust dramaturgies.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I use Raoul Hilberg's triangle as a kind of a way, really rough way to sort of see the relationship among Germany, Israel, and the United States in terms of their dramaturgies, as Germany is always going to be having to deal with having been the perpetrator nation in its plays for young people. And so the plays themselves are really in dialogue with some really sophisticated pedagogical approaches that really sought to not kind of necessarily demonize, or it's not about guilt, it's about clarity, and it's about building moral responsibility. And that's a kind of a key difference. So all the plays that I look at, you know, I think if you look at Holocaust plays that are a bit older, from say Germany in particular, it's really about German guilt and really identifying that, because that, again, that was from a different generation. But so for the following generations, for younger generations, it's really about building moral responsibility, and in a really kind of it's a bit of a civic lesson. It's very clear, it's very hard, it's very non-sentimental. It's not kind of asking you to believe the Holocaust happened because of some, you know, sort of trick that pulls on your heartstrings. It's telling you that the Holocaust happened, and here's how we know, because this is clear evidence. And, you know, and we also have evidence that, you know, there were bystanders in Germany and there were perpetrators in Germany. You know, we need to not let that happen again. So it's a very proactive, kind of dramaturgy, I argue. In the United States, it's in many respects, I think Anne and Emmett is a change, is a pivot, because in many respects it really was a very kind of bystander, I would say, focused dramaturgy that you also see in certain kinds of Holocaust memory, where, you know, where the Americans are seen as, you know, maybe the good guys at the end, right? And this is a thing that happened somewhere else, and it couldn't happen here. To sort of paraphrase Martin Niemöller's, you know, this idea really did was, I think, embedded in a lot of early Holocaust drama. And then I think you can look at both Anne and Emmett, and also the change in Anne Frank from the original version to the Wendy Kesselman edits that don't give the audience a kind of a reassuring, you know, it's okay, but it ends in a much harder, colder, clinical way. So I think in America, in the United States, I saw the biggest change in terms of its dramaturgy. In Israel, you know, I think Holocaust plays were so the history of Holocaust theater is in many respects, you know, parallel to the history of Israeli theater, you know, having been founded in 1948. And you had a lot of really early Holocaust, really dramatists doing really controversial, really important work, particularly on the left in Israel. Just thinking about playwrights like Hanoch Levine, and really examining various kinds of responsibility. Similarly, Joshua Sobol in the 80s, and really looking at Israeli responsibilities in the present, and youth performance. So that's, you know, in the Israeli example, I talk a lot about Ghetto, because young people, that's really an adult play, I think, but young people are watching that. And, you know, I asked most of my Israeli friends that, you know, one night, everybody had seen Ghetto in high school. It was, you know, everybody had seen it. And so I said, okay, I need to really start rethinking how, you know, what people are being exposed to and when, because all these folks saw this play, you know, when they were 16. But then the Israeli dramaturgy is really about not kind of a performance of victimhood in any way, but it's about performance of resistance in this natality way. And also it's about performances of Israeliness, I think, are very much in these plays, and what it means to be Israeli in your post-war. But the three of them are this kind of Hilberg triangle. This victim, bystander, perpetrator triangle. But I use that as a really rough beginning, and then kind of unpack each category, I think, in a play-specific, country-specific way.
No, I really I like the idea of the triangle, and since you mentioned Sobol and Hanoch, I actually saw a production of Ghetto that was transferred to Berlin. So I saw it in German in I think it was the Maxim Gorky Theater, actually, and this idea of transnational, I mean, we can look at a triangle and consider that the points also, as you point out, or as you write, do have correspondences across the nations. So I just wonder what you think. The Hannah Levin's got a play right now in Berlin.
Yeah.
That is being produced, The Child Dreams, ages 16 and up. I wonder what that means about today's audiences, and then maybe we can open up for questions. Just any thoughts about what it means these days to take an Israeli play, put it in German, or Anne Frank. There is always Anne.
Yeah, I think that actually the yeah, I haven't seen that production, but I'm hoping to get to Berlin in time to. But I think that there's a lot of appetite for looking at the different ways in which these cultures and these countries define and understand themselves. And Israeli theater and theater, I would say Israeli theater and not German theater, but theater in Berlin in particular, are really in dialogue with one another. And I think, particularly in the last 15 years, there's a huge kind of expat community in Berlin in particular. There are a lot of Israelis who live there. And so the dialogue going back and forth also goes the other direction as well. You go to Akko and you see performances that were, at the theater festival there that were, sponsored by the Goethe Institute, So I think that's maybe another element of it, is that there's a lot of government funding, and there's a lot, when we think about who's paying for these plays and who's making these decisions, I think there are some specific, governments are really wanting to be in dialogue with one another because of the kind of relationship that they have in the present. But I haven't seen that play, but I really do want to.
So I'm delighted to see so many people who came, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions. Please raise your digital hand, not your real hand, I will not see you. Raise your digital hand, and I will unmute you and let you speak. And while people are still formulating your questions, I will have a question. Erika, this is my favorite question that I always ask you. You wrote your PhD on which the book is based, surrounded by historians. You wrote the book coming out of the PhD, still surrounded by historians. Me being one of them, Nicole Eaton, who is here, is also a historian. And it is a profoundly drama book. Why should historians of the Holocaust take note of your book? What is your main giveaway for us? Because we are an infamously theory-shy bunch. Yeah, we need to have theory, like children need vitamin D. So give us some vitamin D coming from drama.
That's awesome. I mean, the first thought I actually had was not actually from drama, but was from Marianne Hirsch, the notion of post-memory, actually, because I think I think you can really understand these plays as artifacts, as post-memorial artifacts, and it really shows the ways in which each of these respective cultures is trying to remember the Holocaust, because it's trying to remember the Holocaust that way because it's trying to define itself in a particular kind of way. So these different dramaturgical this triangle has as much to do with how these countries want to see themselves in the present as it does, and potentially in the future as it does with how they understand the past. I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but the other thing I think is that my training, my training is I think really it is embedded in history, and I think that the historical and theater history is always this kind of moving. It's always this moving target, because you've got when the play was written, you've got when the or devised or whatever, and then you've got the performances of it. It's a time-based art, and performances will evolve, will change based on based on the current moment. And so they're really good kind of, you can see the pulse through drama.
Manon van der Water has a question.
Yes, I do. Can you all hear me? I guess you could. Yeah. So I have a question, Erika. Thank you for alerting me to this talk, first of all. And, you mentioned somewhere here the little matchbox, and I've always found that one of the most fascinating, interesting plays in the work that you wrote about early on. And you said you would say something more later on. So I am now wondering about what is that you were going to say later on, because for me that was then, what did you say? How long have you been working on this? A long time.
Long time.
And still now, because in the recent developments, of course, we're kind of like going to think about it. And as you were talking, there were a couple of things I was wondering about. It's like, okay, you were saying that a lot of it has to go or is around people who were witnesses then or lived there, like Anne Frank or Anne Frank versus or with Emmett Till, which I totally see, and a lot of others, as you well know, and I know. So I was wondering if that is going to be, if it's getting more and more in the past, if it become a past. But the little matchbox is, or matchboxes, I can't even remember.
Matchboxes, yeah.
Matchboxes are really sort of timeless. It just, it's kind of like, okay, this can happen now. This can, and we'll see, unfortunately, in the foreseeable future that this play will remain very, very current. So anyway, those of the people who don't know it, just talk a little bit more about it.
Yes. So, and Manon, I don't know if you've met Amichai Pardo is the performer of it, and he's here as well, so you guys can wave. I want another, I can connect you afterward on Facebook, actually, but this is great. But so for those of you who don't know, Tin Matchboxes actually takes a short story by Janusz Korczak and then stages it. And in this play, or in the story is about how this this rabbi tells, and in the story it's these young boys, but it's changed into a gender neutral, so it's not just boys, it's anybody in the audience. Basically builds things with their imagination, and so there's like I mean Amichai, I don't know how many matchboxes have you actually used over the years, like. Oh, you're on mute.
I guess thousands and thousands of matchboxes. Yes, it's running almost 25 years. The performance all over the world.
And so what's really, I think, key to this is that it's taking something new and making something new with something that was by somebody who was murdered in the Holocaust, but it's not telling the story of the Holocaust itself. What it's doing is really honoring the memory of Janusz Korczak. And then what Amichai does at the end is there's this really careful consideration of sort of derobing and coming out of character, and then communicating to the young people in the audience, that Janusz Korczak died, and while a number of the children that were in his care, at the time were also murdered in the Holocaust, died. There were lots more young people who survived, and that his words and his philosophies have been so impactful in terms of like just the development of youth rights. And so what that does, that's I think different from some of these other plays, is that there's an honoring of his memory outside of just the Holocaust. And so it's not limiting it it's not limiting Korczak to just a Holocaust story. It's a much bigger, and so by doing that, then it actually does have a really big reverberation, because then you see the impact of of this great mind that was then murdered. But I think it's probably in some respects one of the most profound, because it's not a typical kind of Holocaust story. But what's really interesting is, so I talked to Amichai back in 2009, and then we reconnected just a year or two later. I mean, a year or two ago, and I said, well, how's it still going? And I got to compare my interview notes. And what was really striking to me was that he's taken it all over the world now. And there are still kind of no two performances that are the same, but the format of it, which is a one-man show made with the young people that are in the audience, that act of co-creation seems to work everywhere you go. And so that's a fundamental difference, where it's not about kind of nailing the right kind of text. It's about facilitation, basically, as much as it is like the facilitation of it is inherent to the dramaturgy.
If I can add something,
yeah.
I think the motivation of doing this performance. My name is Amichai Pardo, and I'm an actor for children, the Orna Porat Theater for Children and Youth in Tel Aviv. And the motivation to start to do this performance was that Janusz Korczak was a Shoah hero, a Holocaust hero in Israel, specifically because how he went with his children to Treblinka, and that he was offered not to go with them, and he decided to go with them. And for me, the challenge was to take him out from the Holocaust, bring him back to the children with humor, and to talk with them not about being victim, but about humanism, about how they are going to act in the future in life today, to build new generation that is like Janusz Korczak. It was not nationalist. For Janusz Korczak was the same. If you are Pole, if you are Jewish, if you are Chinese, you are a child is a child. And for me to go to the children of Israel, to talk with them about humanism, children's rights, taking responsibility about your life, also against the world of adults, that you can change things, and to talk about the future, this was the main thing. And it's in this way, like Erika said, it's honoring Janusz Korczak as a person who lived, not as a person who was murdered.
I think Andy Waldron has his hand up.
Hi, Erika.
Hi, Andy.
Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for talking about your book. I have not read it yet, but I'm looking forward to checking it out in greater detail. I had a question for you regarding theater of genocide. I want to say theater of Holocaust, but I know that Holocaust, the term itself, is a very special term, right? And I'm wondering about, do you see any similar trends in how genocide is communicated in theater to youth outside of the Holocaust? So in other words, do you see similarities between theater of the Holocaust for youth versus other theater pieces that are coming out regarding genocide, mass killings, those kind of pieces? And is that subject even being broached with youth in performance? I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, is this a Holocaust specific youth moment, or is youth being performed in for discussing other genocides?
Yeah, I think that's a really really good question. And I mean, what I would say is, I think that there's not, I think there are many more plays about the Holocaust than there are about other genocides. Also because there are many more plays about the Holocaust than there are about lots of other historical events as well. I mean, I think that the Holocaust, people turn to drama, I think, to teach the Holocaust and to talk about the Holocaust because it presents a particular set of challenges. It's a really difficult thing to talk about. And so, what I think your comment kind of suggests that there's probably real space for thinking about drama as a tool for examining genocide in a historical way. using the stage. However, what I do think that there's quite a lot of is work in, you know, sort of applied, community-based, facilitated drama and education kind of work, where you're working with young people in communities that have been impacted, refugee communities, and you're allowing, again, it's about co-creation in those spaces, right? You're using a lot of these techniques that work really well. But you know, that's so there's that kind of work in refugee camps, et cetera, and I would say that's really robust. You know, there's certain funding bodies that support some of that kind of work. You know, the United Nations has supported certain kinds of political engagement, you know, work. I mean, you've written about some of that. That's not specific about genocide, you know, but about kind of, you know, healthcare issues and education. But I think your comment really shows that there's probably, you know, my Bob Skloot, you know, my other amazing supervisor, along with Manon van der Water, wrote this great book looking at theater of genocide after his two, you know, books about theater of the Holocaust. And you know, I think it'd be really interesting to do a similar examination of youth plays. So yeah, we can maybe have a chat.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I think the final question will go to Cenk-Yaoye. If you could unmute yourself, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Yeah, hello. I'm a PhD student at Bristol, and your book is highly relevant to my project. I'm doing my thesis about staging the real life perpetrators in Holocaust theater and on the British stage. So I'm glad that you mentioned the Ralph Hilbert's triad, bystander, perpetrator, and victims, because that's where also my thesis started from. So I was wondering, because you mentioned a lot of examples of plays and performances that is about the memory of the victims and the victimhood. So I'm wondering, what's the place of the perpetrators in relation to youth performance in these three countries? And that is my first question. And I have a lot of questions. And my second question is, since you are now in UK, what's the landscape of the British stage, the British youth performance in Britain and Holocaust memory? And yeah, that is my two questions I want to ask for now. And yeah.
That's great. That's great. I'll answer the second one first. I'll go backwards. Thank you so much for your questions. And yeah, send me an email. We'll set up a Zoom sometime, because yeah, I'd be super happy to hear more about your research as well. But so in terms of the UK, you know, I almost added a fourth chapter actually on British depictions of the Holocaust in theater. And, you know, I would say for young audiences, and I would say that in the UK context, the Kindertransport is incredibly relevant, because the Kindertransport you know, brought young people to the UK, and it's very much a part of to British memory of the Holocaust itself. I mean, you know, the British memory of the war is a very different one. It's a very different memory space because of you know, because of the Blitz, because of bombings, you know, because of just the proximity, but also the Kindertransport. And so you have multiple plays about the Kindertransport coming out of the UK. I write about the Kindertransport as well. There's a play called Die Kindertransporte, and it's a documentary theater play from the Theater an der Parkauer in Berlin. So that's also, you know, so there's a number, and then there's some American plays as well about the Kindertransport, but it occupies a very particular personal place in the British landscape. And then there's also Korshak, Janusz Korshak, another, you know, thought I had when I was looking at how to organize this as a book. I almost had a chapter just on Korshak depictions, because there's lots, you know, obviously I've talked about in Israel, but of course there's many in Poland, there's many in the United States, and then there's also David Grieg's play Korshak's Example is maybe one that you'd be interested in looking at as well. And then there's also German depictions of Korshak. But so I would say you know, this is a rough kind of generalization, because what can you say in an hour about 20 years of Holocaust plays, but But I would say roughly the British plays map closer in many respects to the European experience, and so share some similarities to the German plays that I write about, more than some of the kind of American examples, even though we're talking about the Anglosphere. And then you had another question that was great, but I don't.
Yeah, that's the perspective of the perpetrator in
perspective of-
relation
yeah,
to youth
that's
performance.
That's an excellent question. And what's really striking is that the perpetration is really not there are not many characters in these plays that are perpetrators. In the book, I do a little mini analysis, particularly in the German plays, of just how rarely you have a perpetrator. They'll often be kind of a side character that causes something, but the idea is that the protagonists are the young people who were impacted, and so the idea is you wouldn't. And this is also, when you're writing plays for young people to perform, I think there's also considerations about whose words are they saying, right, as well. And so there's kind of ethical considerations of, casting a young person as a perpetrator. And some of these plays are written for adult or young audiences to perform. Probably the biggest example of a perpetrator would be in James Still's play, And Then They Came for Me. That's an American play. There's a character who's unnamed, and he's a member of the Hitler Youth. And then another play to look at that I don't write about in the book, but that Jeanette Rubin writes about, is called Tea, Money, and Wolf. Actually, some colleagues of Rebecca's at Kansas actually wrote that play, and that's often done by youth groups, and it's often done as a reading play, and that imagines a conversation between a young adult and an older gentleman who you find out had been a Nazi in his youth and was arrested. So those are some maybe interesting examples, but perpetration in these plays often exists in a kind of an awkward space, because the idea is, I think, more about foregrounding the voice of the young young individual who's being really directly impacted by the Holocaust.
Thank you.
I think talking about Britain and talking about perpetrators, the elephant in the room, is quite a powerful question to end on. Rebecca and Erika, do you have anything that you want to say before we close?
I just wanted to make a comment about a couple of the last questions. I think looking at the perpetrator is really important, and Erika, you're so right, and you make it so clear in your work. Even the plays that you talk about in Theresienstadt, the Brundebeer, where there is a kind of masking of an evil person, kind of like Adolf Hitler, that is played by a child. In Anne Frank, notorious that you only hear the boots on the stairs, and that the focus is not on the perpetrator. But in some of the other plays that deal with other genocides, I'm thinking about some of the co-created and community-sponsored work in Rwanda every year, the dance and the music that is absolutely intergenerational in the commemoration, the singing, the dancing, the skits, and the dance drama. And, one of our students' favorites is Lauren Yee and her Cambodian rock band. I would say the audience would maybe be, I suppose you could bring 16-year-olds to it. I'm not sure. She certainly didn't write it for kids, but there's a rock concert. It's a memory play. Do you know it, Erika?
I know of it. I've not seen it, but I know of it. Yeah.
It actually has a narrator Dutch, who is based on the real Dutch, one of the people who was in charge of Tuang Slang, excuse me, the prison 21
Yeah.
in in the Cambodian genocide. And he is this figure who transforms himself into different characters, and he stops the play, and he has other characters going back in time and going across spaces, though in a sense it's about a father and a daughter who come together based on the trials,
Mhm.
and is a rock concert really in the past and the present. And there's a really interesting depiction of the perpetrator who is based on a real person in that particular play. But there were those were really good questions, and I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for giving me the chance.
Erika, closing words?
Yeah, thank you all so much for the great questions, just for being here. There's some really wonderful familiar faces that I've met throughout the years of working on this project, and some new faces and the next generation of looking at Holocaust drama. So that's fantastic. And I've put in the chat a little link if anybody wants to send it to their librarian to purchase the book for your institution's libraries. I mean, you could buy it yourself too if you want, but there's a 35% discount. And this is for the British one, but if you need an American one, if that doesn't work, just let me know, and I'm sure Bloomsbury will give us the hookup. But thank you again, Anna, for setting this up and inviting me. And Rebecca, thank you so much for your careful reading of my work. And this has just been wonderful. Thank you all.
Please join me in thanking Rebecca and Erika. This was wonderful. Goodbye.
Bye.
I will now kick everyone out so that they can download. Also, keep inviting Erika Hughes for more book talks.
I love to talk about this, obviously.
Okay, I will stop recording.